4 minutes after 10, and you'll indulge me for a moment, I know. Just reading a text from Lorna. She says, James, I can't believe it's results day in your house. It seems like only yesterday that the cab driver called in after dropping you off at the hospital and shared your firstborn's name and weight live on the radio. Yes, it picked up my mum, I think, that particular cab driver. But there we are, 16 years. And congratulations, commiserations, whatever it may be, in your world, if GCSEs are part of it today. And I may not be the time to say this, but if they haven't gone well, and I'm delighted to tell you that ours have, in the enormous scheme of things, you will look back and wonder why you were so devastated to discover results that you have been disappointed by, but not for today. Today, you just feel rotten. And I feel for you. 5 minutes after 10 is the time, and we will talk about GCSEs from what I find a fascinating perspective. One of the great mysteries of modern politics is the Red Wall. And I mean, to me, it's probably not a mystery to you. You probably understand it perfectly. And this sort of hemorrhaging of traditional Labour support that we saw at the last general election, and it was a culmination. It wasn't a flash in the pan. It was part of a process. It was an incremental process. There were warning signs. There were alarm bells. There are a number of reasons for it, I think. Some of them fairly obvious. People persuaded that Brexit would be a good idea made up a huge part of that constituency, and a few of them possibly still clinging on to the idea that it will be. You've got the failure of the last Labour leader to cut through and to win over people in those parts of the country. Not all people. Some people loved him, but all of the polling reflects the fact that was a major factor. A sort of beauty contest, if you like, between for my money, between a rock and a hard place. But it was a beauty contest that Boris Johnson won on a scale that hadn't been seen since 1935. So that will be part of it. The Brexit, the personality cults that clashed. But there's got to be more to it than that. And that phrase levelling up, I think, was part of it, wasn't it? A true sense outside the South and the Southeast that your part of the world had been left behind. And it's statistically true. This isn't an opinion, as I like to say. This is counting. There is a divide. There are measurable differences in income, quality of life expectancy, health outcomes, and now in GCSEs. And I've lived in London since 1991, but I don't feel like a Londoner in the sense of these sort of conversations. My parents are both from Yorkshire. I went to school up there, albeit in very rarefied circumstances, but the accents of my childhood, the accents of my youth are Yorkshire and Birmingham and Manchester accents. So I feel like a countryman rather than a cityman, if you like. And that adds to my confusion about these issues. That adds to my dismay as well, because unfortunately, albeit that these imbalances are true, albeit that these divisions are real, the idea that Boris Johnson and his peculiar band of inadequates and weirdos were genuinely going to deliver to the north or to the regions while taking away from the southeast and the capital always struck me as absolutely, let's just say, to be kind, unlikely. The idea of Boris Johnson prioritising anybody above his own immediate gratification is, of course, as I think, again, almost everybody has now accepted, a pie in the sky. But the people he surrounded himself with, the Rees-Moggs, are going to help bring the North up to the level with the South. Man who thinks people die in infernos because they lack common sense. A man who was born 3-0 up and thinks he scored a hat-trick is somehow going to look at inequality and division in this country. There's talk of him being levelling up secretary in a Liz Truss government, which I think gives you a fair indication of just what a rocky ride we're all in for. But it's real. The division is real, and that, of course, is why they were able to exploit it, by pretending that they were going to close these gaps, by pretending that they cared, by pretending that they had answers to some of the questions I'm going to ask. So hundreds of thousands of teenagers received their GCSE results this morning. The decline in top grades is a little smaller than expected, and it's pretty easy to understand what happened. Last year, teachers essentially predicted the grades or assessed the grades. The grade last year was based pretty much entirely upon what the teacher teaching the course said you were going to get in it. So it was inevitably a little higher than what happens when you actually sit the exams and do the papers yourself. There was extra help involved for accommodation of the fact that this is a cohort that had their education disrupted for 2 years. The first year group to sit GCSE exams since 2019. It's amazing how quickly the world turns, isn't it? Not just Lorna's text about me sitting here, not in this studio, but behind this microphone when my daughter, who's just got her GCSE results, was actually born. Do you think I've been doing this job too long, Keith? Could it possibly be time for a change? Oh, you're very sweet. But the world also turns in the short term. As you think back, it's 2019 is the last year that people actually sat GCSE exams. It in many ways feels like we're back to normal, and in many other ways, one wonders what the ramifications and repercussions of these disruptions are going to be with us for generations, or at least for a generation. So the figures show that London, in particular, is pulling further ahead of the rest of the country. And I don't know why. Nor do you, not for sure. But let's have a crack. So the top grades, London has had the biggest growth. It was already ahead, a 6.9 percentage point increase on 2019. In, for example, the East Midlands, it's 4.2%. It is measurable and distinct to see that London, and by extension, I think the South East, although obviously the numbers are being crunched as we speak, gets better exam results than everywhere else in the country. And that's simply the question I want you to answer today. Why do London's pupils get better exam results than everyone else in the country? Here are the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. And of course, this being this programme, we will perhaps have a little wonder about how things might be improved. How do you fix that? What would be the political answer to something like this? It's almost a shame that the word levelling up, the words levelling up have been co-opted by this Conservative Party because, as we've established, it seems to me highly unlikely that they're going to do anything of the sort. But we can have a go. We can have a think about it. What would political intervention look like? Given that we have learned this week of schools facing potential oblivion as energy bills come in. We spoke to a head teacher yesterday who's not only had to find the money for a new boiler, a whole new heating system in his school, he's got to find the money for teacher pay rises that the government have announced without providing any cash for them, and he's got to prepare for uncapped energy bills kicking in the next few months during winter with no knowledge at the moment of where on earth the money's going to come from to pay for it. So if we were to conclude at 11 o'clock this morning that what is needed is a lot more investment and a lot more money for schools, then the bad news is it doesn't seem to me likely that they're going to get it. So how else might we begin to close this gap? It's a relatively simple question, but I suspect some of the answers will be complicated. Why do GCSE students in London do better than everywhere else? 0345 6060 973. And particularly for teachers, if you're not too busy today, mopping up the tears or dancing in the streets with your pupils and your charges, how would you fix it? I should probably put my cards on the table. My own education was incredibly privileged. I went to school in North Yorkshire, but I went to the sort of school that is not part of these trends. You know, the fact that it was fee paying, it makes it a sort of a microclimate that's immune to things like the north-south divide, not least because most of the lads I was at school with were from the south or the southeast. It just happened that we were in a school plonked in the middle of a valley in North Yorkshire. So that's going to be part of my confusion. Some of this may be self-evident to you. And I didn't grow up in London, so I don't have that sense of everybody here is a striver. Everybody here works harder. I mean, there's a lot more immigration here than there is in other parts of the country. That may well prove to be quite a big part of it, something that will be quite hard to swallow, of course, for all the half-wits screaming about dinghies. Is it likely to be immigration that explains why exam results in London are measurably higher than elsewhere in the country? Or something unexpected, something simple, something complicated, whatever it is. I'll take whatever you have. If you hit the numbers now, as the saying goes, you will get through. This would be a nice morning, perhaps, for duck breaking. You thought, you know what, I quite like this programme. I might ring in one day, but I'm a bit nervous. This would be a good day to break your duck, because if you've got something interesting to say, I'm only interested in hearing it. Whenever I say I can't foresee any arguments or debates in the course of this morning's proceedings, it has been pointed out to me that often 5 minutes later I'm in the middle of a right old Barney stroke ding-dong. But I can't currently foresee any controversy popping up here, because it's not fair, it's not right that London does better. And we want to work out why, because if we don't work out why, we'll never be able to fix it. 10:15 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. It is 17 minutes after 10, and we're wondering why exam results in London are higher than in the rest of the country. I don't think it's a silly question. I don't think it's obvious, the answer to that. Some of you wondering why we haven't gone in harder on Emily Maitlis's rather magnificent McTaggart lecture in Edinburgh last night. Well, the answer to that question, you should probably know already, is that I agree with every single syllable that she uttered. But regular listeners to this programme will have heard all of those arguments, and indeed readers of my books will have read all of those arguments, as Emily herself would quite happily agree that there's nothing really to debate. The BBC has been infiltrated by conservative ideologues who do seek to influence the news and have led to a ridiculous situation in which I once had to treat Andrea Leadsom as if she knew as much about the World Trade Organization as Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization. So, I mean, hats off and thank goodness and welcome to Global, but I don't see an hour of phoning in it myself. I could be wrong. We'll find out after 11. But for now, it's the exam results that intrigue me most. Valerie's in Islington. Valerie, what would you like to say?
Morning, and first-time speaker. I'm absolutely a fan of yours, James.
Oh, thank you, Valerie.
Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
The reason why we've done well, I believe personally, because I work in education, in the sort of support staff, is because we've, grabbed hold of the cultural capital that we have in London. We've seen a broader array of people that come in to work in schools that have diverse backgrounds. We're seeing things like drumming for like kids and young people that have SEND. We're looking more about not so much about the results, but about their life skills.
But this conversation is about results. And I love what you're saying. I love what you're telling me. But the question is why are exam results higher here than elsewhere in the country? Is it because the work you're doing actually does improve results, even though it's not uniquely focused on results? You're just creating around a more holistic learning environment and children thrive in it more.
100%, because it is about the global capital, in terms of what we have around us, and kids having, that kind of reach to go outside of the classroom, and obviously to learn in the classroom, but bringing the richness around them into the classroom and more, trips, activities. I feel that even home learning has changed a lot. And I think post-pandemic, the classroom has definitely changed. And I think, children and young people within London are changing as well. And they've got more aspirations. I think that's what's changed as well. That's what's helping.
Right, I'm going to pause you there. I think you might be right, and you're speaking from experience, but I will be interested to see how my listeners in Cleethorpes feel about your statement that children in London have more aspirations. I think you might be right, and I think the reason for it might be what you see out of your window. So you look out of your window and you see one of the greatest, if not the greatest city in the world, and that subconscious belief that the world might just become your oyster one day gets seeded there, and therefore you have greater aspirations. But as someone who grew up in Kidderminster, which, although a jewel in the crown of the West Midlands, is you don't look out of the window in Kidderminster and think the world is your oyster. That works for me. That makes some sense. But of course, there are aspirations everywhere else as well.
True.
What would you do to fix things then? I mean, not from the point of view of where you're working in London, but if you were asked to make changes to the education system in the regions outside London, what would be one way of turning up the dial in the way that you've experienced?
I think it's recruit, right? So those of us that are doing well here, Teach First, I think is a great way of getting teachers from inner city to go, back in the places where we're doing so badly, and also to look at a different kind of approach in the classroom. I don't know what it's like. I've never worked outside of London, obviously, but I have worked, quite in many places within London, and I just see there's just a massive difference in terms of the people that are coming into education as well. Like myself, I started from, sort of like a lower grade, and then I worked up, and then I've seen, and I think the experience as well as my academic abilities has enabled me to help the children and young people within London, which we've got great results, do so well. And it is about aspiration. I think we really need to get back to that, and I think you mentioned where you were raised, and I think maybe because of the surroundings you were in, your parents, etc., and all that kind of impacts that. But it's the cultural capital as well. I think we need to grab a hold of that, and I think at the moment we're not seeing that probably outside of London. So
no, but I hear you, and I mean the numbers suggest that you are right, and there it is. That word aspiration is probably the first one I'm going to write down on my little list of things to jog my memory when I do roundups of where we are. It's not comfortable listening for people outside London. I remember really annoying one of my parents' friends when I was about 19, 20, talking about London as if I couldn't really understand why anybody wouldn't move there, given the chance. And obviously that's incredibly rude and insulting, and I was an arrogant little git. So, I know, hard to believe, we'll change. I really was. But that might well be part of it. It's worth pointing out that 20 or 30 years ago, this wasn't true. It was actually the other way round, and London was lagging behind the rest of the country. So there's probably some pendulums in play. The idea that there was political focus on improving the situation in London, and that has worked. But it means now that the pendulum has swung beyond the areas that once performed better than London. Why would that be? 0345 60 60973. Thank you, Valerie. It's a lovely start. Terry's in Ruislip. Terry, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I think, yes, this word aspiration is key to understanding what's going on.
No, you understand why I'm not 100% comfortable with it.
Right, okay, but there's one other very important factor, and that is what Tony Blair wrote in the Telegraph 2 or possibly 3 days ago. Rip up the current exam system. Yes. It's unfit for the modern world. Now, my theory is that middle-class kids from aspirational families are prepared to put the work in to go through this rather stupid system. They're prepared to waste their youth committing to
Whoa, Terry, they just opened the envelopes, mate. Give them a break, will you? Timing, Terry, timing.
I realise that my timing is unfortunate, but a truth doesn't become less true because of the day of the week upon which you say it.
No, but tone and consideration should be timeless.
Okay, I'll try to be calmer.
Okay.
I think it's provable that it's nonsense for young people to have to commit to memory the formula for the surface area of a trapezium, the formula for solving quadratic equations. There's no need to do that in the modern world. I think
I just want to tempt you down from this hobby horse, pertinent and accurate though it is, and look more at the question then of why would people in the north be less ready to follow this system, even with your disapproval of the system established. I don't understand why geography would play a role in how hard you work.
The answer to that, as somebody who was brought up in the north, would be to say that we're much better at cutting through the nonsense than people in the south. That's rather flippant, but I think perhaps a more serious way of saying the same thing is quite simply that there are more middle-class aspirational families in the south.
Yes.
Therefore, there are more families who are prepared to play the silly game.
No, I'm going to argue with you. Oh, how long did it last? I said there wouldn't be any, but it's not. It's not. This isn't right. Because even if you put in a system that you liked and approved of, this gap would remain. This division would remain. It's got to be more to do with application and aspiration than somehow falling for the rubbishness of the educational system. You can only operate within the educational system that you can operate in. You can't legislate for a fictional universe where we have a different system of exams. You can call for that, but in answering the question of why London does better than the rest of the country on this, it's not because the exam system is flawed. It's because it's being approached differently by two different types of people.
Yeah, and I think that the less aspirational. Yeah. I mean, I don't like to use the word working class. Those kids can sort of see through it and say,
off it.
Why should I sit down
and
waste my time
off it. Well, because the better results you get, the further you go in life is the short equation.
But I suggest that there are those people who've kind of given up on it. They think, I'm not going to get a good job. I'm going to end up working in the warehouse in China.
Now, this I agree with, but that's got nothing to do with the fitness for purpose of the GCSE and A-level system.
I think it has.
I think it has.
Because I think if we had a system which was better geared towards the very different ways in which people learn and the very different ways, the very different capabilities, then I think young people across the board would be motivated.
Well, there we are, though. So, I mean, you've brought us back to the starting point then. Across the board, there would be improvements, which means that the gap would remain.
Not necessarily. Because
then it wouldn't be across the board, would it?
I mean, I do realise, James, that I've got a particular view on this.
I can tell, Terry. I don't know. I'm learning from you. Can I inquire? Were you an educationalist yourself?
Writing books and things.
Yes.
And maybe I'm forcing my worldview onto a particular issue.
We have all been guilty of that, Terry, in the past.
I do feel, if a young person in Chesterfield, where I used to teach, if a young person in Chesterfield were to say to me, what is the point? I mean, I don't like using the word non-academic, but let's use it for now. A young non-academic person in Chesterfield says to me, what is the point of me committing to memory the formula for the surface area of a trapezium? I would say there is no point. It is a wicked trick that has been played on you by Michael Gove. Sorry, I sounded a bit angry there, didn't I?
I think you sounded poetic.
Oh, no, thank you.
You're very welcome. And I'd have more poetry, less trapeziums. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. Terry, thank you. That was lovely. And, of course, the Labour Party did actually launch something called the London Challenge. It was when Estelle Morris, do you remember her, was Education Secretary. Sir Tim Brickhouse was the first chief advisor, and new money was found to support it, a 5-year project that genuinely turned things around. Problem, of course, with successes that were achieved in the country under a Labour government is you never read about them in the British media, do you? It's funny that. 28 after 10 is the time. Terry, thank you. Bemi is in Pitsea. Bemi, what would you like to say?
I just wanted to say, based on what I've heard so far, I used to live in the heart of Hackney, and I was born in Hackney, moved out, went to Kent, came back, had kids, stayed in Hackney, and just recently left and moved to Essex. So in terms of comparing both of them, I would say schools in East London in particular are quite hard on the kids. One, because of gang violence. Yeah, I think it's one because they pump more money into the schools. That's another thing. And they're doing that so that kids stay in school. They're strict so that they don't go out of line. But what they don't realise is the schools out of London are the ones that are actually suffering, because moving out here, my daughter said, one, they behave terribly. Right. If they don't want to learn, they don't have to learn. Whereas they had to work towards sort of credit. They had to walk towards not getting any corrections, no detention. Whereas the school she is now, even if they get detention, that's great. I don't have to do it. And if with homework, it is not compulsory. They just said if they feel like it, they should go online and complete the work. So if you've got those two systems, which one do you think the kids will excel in?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a rhetorical question. There is an interesting story in the news today about a school that is in trouble for being too strict, a school that is facing punishments for being too strict. But you're talking about a sort of grasping by the scruff of the neck of a classroom, and
yeah, I mean, if you tell a kid now that they have options of what to do, I don't feel like that's the right thing to do. As a parent, I don't tell my child, if you don't feel like it, please don't do it. No, if I want you to do it, you're going to do it. So now I feel like, now that we've moved, I'm spending more money travelling to work, but then I'm also having to pump more money in into their education by getting private
tutors and things like that. So simply the wheels are not turning as quickly outside London. That's that's your experience, and it's absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you were listening either late last week or early this week when we were talking about young people arriving in the workplace not being fit for work, and an employer actually told... Oh, I'm late for the news, so I'll finish this story, but you won't be able to respond. And an employer told about someone whose grades were actually really good, but their first assignment, they just didn't do it. They didn't feel any sense of urgency, and it was, what, have you done it yet? No, I couldn't. And that idea perhaps fits in with what you described, but where the London divide comes in on that, we shall explore further after Simon Conway brings us the latest headlines. It is 33 minutes after 10. I did defend Rishi Sunak a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you remember. I don't think it counts as the curse of O'Brien. I defended him very much in a very limited and specific way about one particular incident. He's clearly a pretty ridiculous human being, never mind politician, but these things are all relative. And, you know, in the current cabinet, he stands out, or used to stand out, like a beacon of probity. But when he said that thing in Tunbridge Wells, I didn't think it was quite as rancid as reported, but for two reasons. The first was, it was such an obviously stupid thing to say. I couldn't quite believe that someone who is obviously not stupid said it. That the bit about how we moved funding from poor area, or from cities to poor area, to countryside. He said it in Tunbridge Wells, so I mean it was appallingly misjudged. But he wouldn't have said it knowing there was a camera there if he was actually saying exactly what his harshest, well, almost all his critics concluded he was saying. So that was part of the reason why. But here's the other bit. So Jez has sent me some numbers, which I think actually explain what Rishi Sunak was talking about. In Tower Hamlets, for example, secondary school funding per pupil is £8,647 a year. In Redcar and Cleveland, smack in the middle of the red wall, and indeed one of those constituencies that has swung from red to blue, that figure is £5,983. So, you know, not far off a £3,000 difference in per pupil funding. Now, some of that will be, if you like, London weighting. It will be reflected in the fact that things are more expensive in London, everything from, you know, property prices right through to the price of tea. But some of it is a consequence of deliberate political focus, deliberate political strategy. And that is why London, over the course, well, since 2004 or thereabouts, I think, when that London challenge was brought in 2003, that's why London has excelled. There is simply more money per pupil. So when Rishi Sunak said that thing that sounded awful, I think he was speaking more to these issues than to the idea of picking the pockets of poor people in order to further enrich the denizens of Tunbridge Wells. I could, of course, be wrong. Sally is in Clitheroe. Sally, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm the first caller and I'm really, really nervous, I've got to say.
It's only me. It's only me, Sally.
Yes, you and everybody else.
Oh, there's no one listening.
But I'm I'm just driving along, just dropped my dog off at the vet, and and I hear this, and I'm in the north of England.
Yes.
And although, you know, I live in a really, really beautiful area, but obviously there's I'm in Lancashire, and all I can say is that children don't see that the life in London and elsewhere is for them.
Yeah.
I just think there's such a you know, we all talk about vision boards, don't we? And I don't know what a vision board is. People do. You know, putting the life you want up on a board and manifesting and seeing where you can be. And I just think that in the north of England, in some towns, these towns that used to be big cotton industry towns, and they have these gorgeous old buildings that have been left to go to waste, and now a pub chain occupies or whatever.
Yes.
I just think they're constantly receiving these messages, subliminally or whatever. But I just think they have to be able to see that the world is their oyster, like you've just said. And I think in London and places like that, when you can see things, when you're around things, when you're around cultures that are applauded and supported, but here there are so many towns, there's just nothing for the children. And I do think taking outside of school, what I'm trying to say is whatever is going on in the schools, whatever amazing teachers there may be,
yes, they're on a hiding to nothing, or that they're on a much steeper hill.
Yeah, how do you expect a child to go in and start thinking about maths can take them here, there, and everywhere in the world if at home or in their town
the horizons are tiny? The horizons are tiny, and
we're expecting such a lot from them.
That's a really good point. Here's a problem, though. Do you know what we're doing here? And it occurred to me when I was talking to Valerie earlier. We're coming perilously close to casting inequality as a good thing, because it's people growing up alongside success or material and thinking, well, I'll have a bit of that then.
Absolutely, you've got to see it. You've got to feel it. But I work in legal proceedings and I just read care proceedings all day.
Yeah.
And I kind of think, how do you expect some of these children or people who are on child protection plans, and there are so many of these children, it feels endemic sometimes. The files I read, I know that that's my job and I'm going to see more of it than most people. But, so many families, and we talk about the energy crisis, you've got parents who are worried or scared, who haven't got food, and then you expect a child
to put in a shift at school,
to get a uniform on and go and sit and think, like I say, that maths and chemistry are going to get them out of this when they haven't got enough examples of that.
There's a phrase that we use when we're talking about role models, often in the context of black children, actually, but it certainly applies across class as well as ethnicity. If you can't see it, you can't be it.
And that goes back to the vision board, as cheesy as it sounds.
What is it with these vision boards? What is a vision board? I don't even know what it is.
I don't have one. It's basically a canvas, and you get all your, maybe the house you would want, or whatever you aspire to, or peace, or happiness, or whatever. And you put pictures, and it is.
That's a collage, Sally.
Exactly, a collage. But now they call them vision boards for you to visualise what you'd like and manifest it.
Oh, and the more, I suppose, out of the mainstream, I don't know what the word we want is, but the more removed you are from what's on your vision board, the less likely you are to achieve.
Exactly, and I've got a friend that's
I'll tell you what, hang on a minute, this is quite the debut for someone who was nervous 4 minutes ago. You've really hit your stride now. I know you are.
I'm sorry, because of the files I read and the children that you see, and what people could be, and you just feel that they're hampered.
Yeah, they are held back. They're straitjackets that are socio-economic and geographical. I think
it's outside of school, and that's the other thing. I am not criticizing the teachers. I've got a friend who's very high up in the school,
right?
And I spoke with her a few months ago, and she was literally shaking. She suffers bad anxiety, and she just said her school, you go into it, and she said the problems that these children have, she said, I can't control it. And all they used to do a fair share policy so that children who had special needs or behavioural difficulty would be spread out between the schools, and they got rid of that. So a lot of these children have been left with her, and of course the teacher has to give them the most attention, of course they do, but there's not enough
resource. It's resource.
So she's firefighting. So again, when do you sit down to learn the formula for a circumference of a circle, or what? At what point is that important in the day?
No, I hear you, and it ties in a bit with what Terry was saying. Terry, the poet, giving us his thoughts on the system itself. I mean, there's a hell of a lot to unpick here. Hang on a minute. I just want briefly your thoughts on reports that Jacob Rees-Mogg is being lined up to become the Secretary of State for the Department for Levelling Up.
Fabulous.
Yes?
I mean, no.
I'll leave you with that. I'll leave you with that happy
anyway,
thought.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. So, will we do this again?
Maybe.
I'm
still shaking.
I look forward to it. And it is a beautiful part of the world, the Ribble Valley. Absolutely glorious. I say that as the son of two Yorkshire people. 10:42 is the time. Angela is also in Lancashire, in Ormskirk. Angela, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
I'm also first time getting through to you, but a very, very long time listener.
Welcome.
So I'm very nervous too.
Oh,
Sorry.
Stop it, seriously, honestly. What would you like to say?
I do agree with a lot of what Sally just had to say, but I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle and going back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of funding of red wall areas and versus blue areas. I just did a little bit of rough and ready research using the House of Commons Library website on local authority funding settlements under the local authority funding settlement arrangements.
Right.
And
Thank you for doing it.
Well, I just picked two authorities with relatively comparable population sizes. I chose Preston, obviously being up the road, with 141 million people, or at least in 2018, that's what the figure was.
141,000 people.
Sorry, yes. Million.
I was going to say.
Sorry, you can tell I'm nervous.
No, I'm nervous as well because this is not my comfort zone. But I just said in my head then, hang on, it can't be. That's double the number in the entire country. They can't all be impressed.
I know. Sorry, it's because I've got the word million written down in terms of funding next to it later.
141,000 people in Preston.
And 158,000 in Kensington and Chelsea.
Perfect.
For next year, 2023 funding from the local authority settlement arrangements.
Yes.
Preston gets 5.6 million. Kensington and Chelsea gets 63 million.
Flipping heck.
And bear in mind, council tax rates are actually higher in Lancashire than they are in Kensington and Chelsea.
And they're even lower in Westminster, which is even richer than Kensington and Chelsea.
Yeah, I also looked at Westminster's council tax rates, and I was quite frankly gobsmacked. And, you just think the amount of money that central government is pumping into local authorities, they're the ones who are responsible for funding the schools. And you rightly pointed out the discrepancy in per pupil funding.
Yeah.
And so, of course, if there's a huge disparity in the local authority funding, and it's not because there are fewer people who are paying less, it's actually the opposite.
It looks that way. I mean, that is an almost engineer. I was a bit taken aback yesterday. I don't know if you were listening, to be reminded of that letter that Geoffrey Howe wrote to Margaret Thatcher, mooting the managed decline was the quote of Liverpool.
Decline of Liverpool.
Again, just not just up the road from where you are. And that idea of, there being a consciousness in Westminster of, I know they did it within North Wales, a lot of the old mining communities, so we probably need to get our heads around the fact that this is not accidental almost. This is, if not deliberate, then certainly conscious.
Well, I didn't do any research to compare Labour areas with Tory areas. As soon as you started talking this morning, I immediately fired up.
Why can't all my listeners be like Angela? I mean, this is the kind of listener I want, Angela. Someone who takes the programme as a starting point for finding out more stuff and then sharing it with the rest of us.
Well, I think this is the problem. There's just a lack of information. And I grew up in the Northwest. I went to an ordinary comprehensive school. I did actually leave to go to university, spent a few years away, lived in London, worked in London for a few years, came back home to be closer to the parents. Ultimately, the difference that I see is just a lack of information.
Yeah.
And I think a lack of interest as well in politics. A lot of people just want to get on with their lives, and they'll believe anything that they're sold.
That's the scary bit.
We'll give you loads more money if you vote Tory.
Yeah.
They'll go, right, okay, let's do that then.
Yeah.
I mean,
or your life will get better if you vote Brexit.
Well, exactly that.
And the same thing.
And there's just that lack of information, lack of reliable information. So, I'm always researching this kind of stuff because I'm incredibly passionate about it.
What do you do if you don't? What's your day job, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm a university lecturer.
Oh, fantastic. Well, there it is, and that means you are in a position to make the situation you describe better. But it's a lonely battle, and it's one that I think has been very cynically exploited by the so-called levelling up agenda in the so-called Red Wall. But as Angela herself says, people will believe what they are told. We all have that capacity. We all have that capability. It's why Emily Maitlis is speech in Edinburgh last night about what's rottenness at the core of the BBC now. It's why it was so pertinent and so valuable, because you can't rely upon the BBC to put up a fair representation of the facts by, if you've got two economists talking about Brexit, you have to say that the one who says Brexit is a good idea, he's the only one we could find in the whole country. But the one who's saying Brexit is a terrible idea, that's pretty much every other economist as well in the country. But you stick them on the BBC and treat them as equals. And then you wonder why people end up smacking themselves in the face. Angela, thank you. Covered a lot of ground and top of the class in terms of preparation before coming on air. It's 10:47. It is 10 to 11. James writes, Natalie, please tell Angela she's amazing. I'm from the northeast and live in Wokingham now. It's a different world down here. I see how much money is pumped into my current town. The contrast is ridiculous. I'm shocked at the difference in funding between the two examples she gave. I'm going to start doing a bit of research myself too. That's from Natalie, and this is lovely. Stephen Marie, right, we are also in Clitheroe. We also live in Clitheroe, and we agree with Sally. It's Margaret Clitheroe is the saint, isn't it? You can take the Catholic out of the boy, but you can't. How does it go? I forget which way round it is. Margaret Clitheroe. It always pops into my head. Jules is in Hoylake on the Wirral. Jules, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Hello,
it's just a kind of a more anecdotal than perhaps a couple of the earlier callers, because they're more involved. But I've kind of worked all around the country at different times. I was doing working in the petrochem industry, doing construction and project management leads.
Yeah.
And you meet lots of different people with different backgrounds while you do that. And so I might be in Southampton for 18 months and Newport in Wales for 2 years and like more local up here in Stanlow.
I don't think that's anecdotal. It's your experience.
Yeah, but it's just the personal interactions with adults, not children. And when you're working in a place for a period of time, like, you do get to know people. And I think that it's parents have some responsibility in this as well.
Yeah.
In as much as I found, just as a generalisation, obviously not specifically for anybody, but people were less bothered about their kids doing well at school or what their aspirations were towards a career after that in parts of the country that are not the southeast. I don't know why that is.
Well, it's partly because you can't be what you can't see. So it actually tallies. We're just doing it from the parents' point of view rather than from the child's point of view or the teacher's point of view. And that this idea of grades being a currency which you can exchange for advancement and success is not going to work.
I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I mean,
hang on, I haven't finished.
I'm sorry.
I was about to say, I never interrupt people, Jules. How dare you? Well, because it's not going to land as much if you can't see the success around you. You can't see what you can swap the grades for. Why are you going to go the extra mile to get the grades?
Well, you say that, but again, my experience, my mum and dad lived in North London and moved out to Essex when we were there, little kids, and it's a very working class background. My dad was a printer, my mum did whatever she could to find little part-time jobs, but I've ended up as a senior project engineer and my brother's a CEO of a bank. My mum and dad couldn't see those things, we couldn't see those things.
Oh, but you could more than you would have done in Clitheroe.
And we're talking about 60s, 70s and 80s London. I mean, perhaps the 80s
That's when the city kicked off. That's when loads of money landed. No, I'm tell you what, for an hour in which I wasn't going to argue with anyone, I've made a pretty good fist of arguing with everyone. So, but no, I think you could, even as London wasn't doing the aspiration, the schools wouldn't have been able to provide it with you, but if you were getting it at home, what you saw out of your window in London would... Go on.
Let's switch that away a bit then, because the industry that I was working in, petrochem, it's always been well paid, and it's had lots of jobs, sort of good quality jobs with good money and good career prospects. And I'm talking about people who are working in those environments, not having those aspirations for their kids. So they could see it.
Yeah, no, okay. I mean, you can't be it if you can't see it, and that tallies actually with the figures at the time about what London schools were doing. They were underperforming the rest of the country. So no, you're almost certainly right. But that idea about parents, you see, you've got to, as a middle class parent, you've got to be conscious of not being too pushy, but some of the investment that parents have in their children's exam results is scary, actually, and it puts enormous pressure on kids who are already putting enough pressure on themselves. And for Jules's analysis and many others, that pressure is not being put in place outside the capital, which is not necessarily an unalloyed bad thing. You just need to get the balance right, don't you? You want some sense of pressure. Otherwise, you're going to turn up for work like the girl we heard about earlier this week, just sort of not aware of any sense of being expected to complete a task, even though on paper she was a great candidate. Or you're going to end up, making yourself poorly by stressing too much. Everything is about balance, I think. Jules is on the Wirral. Claire is in Clapham, so from the north to the south. Claire, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi.
Hello, Claire.
So I used to teach, I'm not a secondary school teacher anymore, but I taught for 7 years in sort of inner London.
Oh, yeah.
And I did my teacher training sort of further out in sort of Barking, Welling, suburbs around London. And I could not get over the difference in sort of attitude to learning and ambition. So just to echo that thing that you were saying about kind of you cannot.
Do you know, I've been doing this job for nearly 20 years and I still get absolutely ambushed sometimes. I didn't even cross my mind in my burblings at the top of the show that it would be something as that so many people listening would think it was self-evident that parental ambition, parental aspiration becomes pupil imbalance, pupil inequality.
Yeah, well, what I think happened in the suburbs in those areas was generally, it's a much more kind of white working class demographic, and parents had done well despite not doing well at school. So a lot of them were self-made. They'd kind of worked in, plumbers, builders, that kind of thing, or they'd started their own little businesses and they were doing well. So the girls in particular had no ambition. They just, really didn't, and this is a while ago. I don't know if it would be so much right now, but this was, going back sort of 15 years. But the thing I kind of really wanted just to highlight in terms of when I started working in inner London, so I taught in the creative media department, and it's on top of, you get your basic education, but so much is about enrichment and opportunities. And I was blown away by the opportunities that those pupils were getting to access just incredible organisations. I mean, I took a small group to interview the Prime Minister as part of a BBC news project.
Seriously? Who was which Prime Minister?
Gordon Brown.
Okay. So I did actually interview Gordon Brown, so I'm not going to overcome with the green-eyed monster on this one, but I haven't interviewed anyone since.
Yeah, and we used to have a funded thing where the whole of Year 9 we would take for a week to the British Film Institute and the Royal Festival Hall, and they would work with professionals for a whole week, a whole year group there for a whole week every day. You would get, because so many of them were Arts Council funded, and as part of that they have to reach out to the community. We'd get free West End theatre tickets.
Really?
We could go to the National Gallery, BBC, all of these organisations that were on the doorstep, and you got free travel. So you get free pass to go on the tube. So it costs.
And this would all have been part, I think, of the London Challenge, wouldn't it? It would have, because it kicked off in 2003, and you were there in its glory days, as it were. Yeah. And what we're seeing is the inevitable upshot of that. So a similar focus across the whole country would now bring levelling up into play, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and you'd get all, it would not be unusual for a newsreader to come and do a talk to your class because they lived around the corner. They could pop in.
You can't be what you can't see.
Yeah, absolutely. We had, Duchess of Cornwall's been to my son's school. Jamie Oliver filmed an episode of, one of his food programmes. Yeah. So it's just there. They see it all. And then, you think about most young people now, they can't afford to move out, so they've got to stay living at home in their early 20s. And that's the key time when you're trying to get a job.
I've had such amazing callers today. I had never thought of any of this stuff because of my own background, because I ended up in London after school and never left. Yeah. And I'm raising my children in London. But of course, if I had raised them in Kidderminster, they would have genuinely different worldviews, ambitions and aspirations.
And if you want to work in the creative media arts, you've often got to start doing unpaid work experience. Yeah. Well, you can't do that if you've got to schlep, do a 2-hour commute and that kind of thing, and it's going to cost you more in rail travel. Yeah, if you're nearby, if you live in Southwark, you live in Lambeth, you're really, you're close by, you can quickly jump on the bus, get to the ITV studios, you can work long hours, all that kind of stuff.
So if you don't have those, kind of connections,
and that translates into aspiration. Thank you, Claire. I mean, everyone actually who's contributed this hour had a better perspective on the issue than I did. I hope we don't make a habit of that. Not every single caller has got a clearer vision of the issue than I have. That would become embarrassing in the long term. But that was absolutely exceptional. I wasn't even sure about the topic at 10 o'clock either. But the tragic conclusion is, of course, that levelling up is desperately needed. But it's already been ambushed and hijacked and co-opted and corrupted by the worst generation of politicians this country has ever seen. So the likelihood of Jacob Rees-Mogg making a decent fist of being Secretary of State for levelling up, if that rumour turns out to be true, is about the same likelihood as him suddenly developing a conscience or a double-figure IQ. In the next hour, we're going to talk about phones or food. I like the food story. Everyone else likes the phones one. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And I can tell you that the speech Emily Maitlis gave at the Edinburgh TV Festival last night, raising profound concerns about the BBC's relationship with the Conservative Party, will be forming the inaugural episode, a sort of bonus episode, a taster, an aperitif, if you will, of the podcast that Emily and John Sopel are about to start making under these roofs, the Newsagents podcast, available on Global Player. So I'll give you a quick heads up as soon as that's been published, because you really should. You really should check it out. 4 minutes after 11 is the time, and I may even play you a little snippet of it this hour. I'm going to talk about phones. It's funny, isn't it, that I get some lovely messages today. I'm not going to read them all out, but thank you. I did mention at the top of the show that my oldest got her GCSE results this morning, and a lot of you have been in touch to marvel at the fact that we've been together for 16 years, for all of those 16 years, you and me. I know not everybody has, but, it is incredible when you think about it. How many other people have you spent 3 hours a day talking to for the last 20 years? You probably spend more time listening to me than you do to your partner. Well, certainly relationship might have lasted longer than many other relationships. It's funny, isn't it? Because I just found myself reflecting on something I told you in the relatively early days of parenthood. I'd say about half time in my parenting career so far. One of the more embarrassing things I've admitted to you is that I once caught myself checking my phone over the head of one of my daughters while reading them a bedtime story. And it was one of those things that just, I don't know why, I wouldn't have noticed it. And yet when I did just clock what was going on, I felt absolutely shamed. I felt appalling. When I didn't have children, when I looked ahead to becoming a dad, one of the things I always fantasized about was the telling of the bedtime story. I had such plans for making up my own, and really, really, really looked forward to it. And they all came true. My dreams came true. I did love it, and I did sometimes make up my own, although I'm turned out not to be anywhere near as good at making up stories for children as I thought I was going to be. Sid the Snake was one of the classics. And then suddenly I caught myself checking my phone. I can't even remember whether it was Twitter or something, checking my phone in that moment. And now that, the last thing they'd want from me is a bedtime story, those days are gone. And somehow it becomes even more shameful. Luckily, I caught myself doing it, and I nipped it in the bud, and I didn't do it again. But I couldn't look you in the eye and say that I hadn't done it before. I just noticed it for some reason that night. I don't know why. And that's why when I read the story today about mums and dads who spend too much time on their smartphones being more likely to be bad parents, I wince a little bit inside. If you're dealing with a stressful household, you are more likely to turn to social media to relax, but it's a vicious circle that then leads the parents turning more to social media to relax, to nag and yell more at their children, researchers have found. It's a modest piece of research from the University of Waterloo in Canada that's been reported in the Computers in Human Behaviour journal, and obviously the headline has seen the research picked up by the newspapers. 549 adults with at least 2 children under 19, and they looked at their use of digital media, they looked at their mental health, and they looked at their parenting practices. And the conclusion, among others, was that the more you used social media to retreat from spending time with your family, the worse your parenting became. I mean, that's not a pretty message, is it? To learn, because we all, almost by definition, spend a hell of a lot more time on social media than our parents did when they were bringing us up, just because of the advancement of technology and the arrival of it. So the lead author of this research, Jasmine Zhang, said all members of the family matter when we try to understand families in a society saturated with technology. It's not just children who are often on devices. Parents use digital media for many reasons, and these behaviours can impact their children. So how are we going to do this as a topic? Well, I've had some thoughts. The first is rather obvious, and it involves you doing what I did. Noticing that you were doing it and making a conscious effort to change. Now, I think ideally in the context of parenting with the children, but I wonder whether we should actually broaden it out a little bit and talk about actually, I think we absolutely have to broaden it out a little bit. So this is about what happens when you make a conscious effort to cut down on your phone time. Because you go from catching yourself checking it over the head of one of your children when you're reading them a bedtime story. I have to really try to turn off Twitter. I get FOMO. I love Twitter, as you know. I think it's absolutely wonderful. In fact, this week's Full Disclosure with John Cleese, he also enthuses massively about how much he loves Twitter, and it's made a meaningful change to his entire relationship with the media. One of many fascinating nuggets that will pop up in that interview, which will be with you tomorrow. But the tyranny of it, or the distracting nature of it, is pretty insidious. Even if you're doing good stuff, like, checking up on the news. What's wrong with checking up on the news? And I use that terrible excuse if one of my kids says, "Dad, get off Twitter." I'll say, "Oh, I need it for work. I'm just checking. I'm not checking up on work. I'm seeing how many likes my last little pearl of wisdom has clocked up, or how close I am to getting over the 1 million mark. I need it for work. I need to check it for work." Absolute cobblers. So what I want to try to do is plot what happens when you do consciously cut down. Okay, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Did you do it? Have you actually made an effort and measured the impact, measured the benefits? Just let me know. 0345 6060 973. And the other bit of it, and I'm not sure about this, I'm trying to work it out in my head. And it's another one of those occasions where I reflect upon how old I am now. And I used to have these conversations in a way that made it feel as if I was at the vanguard of the discovery. It was my generation that was doing all this stuff for the first time. But there must be people listening to this who are now adults, or young adults, who can actually talk about what it was like to have parents who were on their phones too much when they were growing up. I find that quite hard to get my head around. My dad's first mobile phone was the size of a wheelbarrow. I mean, it almost was a wheelbarrow. It was a briefcase phone that he would wear over his shoulder. He was a newspaper journalist, so we would have been among the first in the country to have a mobile phone that was only barely mobile. So the idea of a smartphone being in your parents' hands while you were being raised, the dinner table, smartphones at the dinner table, for someone of my age, as a child, it would have been unimaginable. But I'm 50. If you're like 20, then it would have been fairly commonplace as you were growing up for smartphones to be perhaps demanding more of your parents' attention than you would have liked. So let's do it. Let's do it both ways round. What is the difference that it makes to you, either as a parent or a child? I hope I get the second calls. Because I'd love to know whether or not have you clocked it? Are you conscious of it? Are you aware of it? Are you sitting there now going, "Oh, blimey, do you know what? I've never noticed it before, but Mum and Dad were on their phones too much when I was growing up." I like it as a topic, but it needs interesting analysis, which you will provide now by dialing 0345 6060 973. The research, essentially goes further, because it says that you are more likely to be short-tempered, to be yelly and naggy, if you are seeking solace in social media too much. And I think it's time for a bit of a mea culpa. I recognise that. Because what it does, I think, is it allows you to build up a sort of an escape route from the environment you're in, doesn't it? You go off into an almost parallel universe where Twitter in my case, but Instagram perhaps in yours, or Snapchat, or whatever it is, Facebook, I suppose, if you're even older than me. You go off and you get immersed in it. That's the whole point. And it's designed, of course, to keep you there for as long as possible, because that way you get more eyeballs on more adverts. And then when it's okay, so let's call it a spell, and then the spell is broken, and that makes you tetchy. So you actually do end up. So, Dad, come on, Dad, get off Twitter. Oh, I'm not on Twitter too. And that's not good. I'd fight a little shy of calling it bad parenting, which is the headline that the newspapers have put on the story, but I don't know if it's necessarily the phraseology that the researchers themselves would have used, but it actually makes sense, doesn't it? What have you done? How do you change it? Let's do a bit of advice for each other as well. Listening to this, my kids are too old now, but if you're listening to this, Jess says, I can't phone in on this one. The guilt is too strong. Yeah, well, I'm wrestling a little bit too with this. So what do you do? How do you make it better? Because I suspect we all know, don't we? We all know that the phone has replaced the bedtime story from the other end of the age range. You know, too many parents now park a little device in their children's hands as a distraction technique, as a babysitter. Mark in Coventry puts it well. Mine are 16 and 20 now. The thing I miss most is reading them a bedtime story. I'm also a year 2 teacher, and the thing that saddens me is that so many children don't get that special time anymore. They fall asleep watching a small screen. It's truly sad. I think it is. It's not like, Luddite, not wanting to get rid of the technology, but that personal parental connection cuts both ways. And I think we'll talk about that. All right, hope you will, because I can't carry on for a whole hour uninterrupted. Keith will resign. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 16 minutes after 11, Gary says, I've made a real effort to cut back and leave my phone on the side when I'm with the children, especially during the week. I'm trying to teach my son about balance, and I can't if I'm not implementing it myself. Time and a place. Easier said than done, though, as most people, I think, listening will recognise. Let's go to Emily, who's in Grantham. Emily, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi.
Pick up the phone. You picked up the phone. You're supposed to be putting down the phone, and I've just made you pick up the phone. I do apologise.
I know, I'm with my children as well. I know.
Oh, no. Terrible.
I felt quite passionately, really, I'm nearly 30 now. However, considering myself a young parent of 2, one of the outliers, perhaps, maybe that's being too arrogant, I want to be the sort of parent who isn't massively engaged with social media, especially seeing a load of parents who are.
Yes.
And I have noticed it massively affect my parenting. And I think one of the main things is with 2 young children, when I disengage from it, I'm able to play, for a longer period of time, able to engage, in whether it's bedtime stories or whatever.
Yes.
It just makes for a much more peaceful and better relationship with parents, I think. You're not constantly comparing with other parents and what they may be doing.
Oh, that's a different angle. That's a different angle. I hadn't thought of that. So in fact, it's the opposite of what I just described as being a sanctuary, like an alternative universe where you can get away from the hustle and bustle of home. What the danger is that you actually end up comparing yourself to other homes and thinking yours is not up to sniff.
Yeah, exactly. I think it can be a bit of solace in those moments where you feel slightly overwhelmed. You seek to go on your phone and connect with another world, but it's not really. I could go into it in loads more detail, really, but I think the essence of it is perhaps we're trying to find something we don't get in real life anymore, and being lonely and trying to get a community there. But
so what are you going to do then?
I do sort of practical things like trying to keep my phone in another room, or making time limits, for example, just so I can keep away from it for a while.
I think you can do that, can't you? On your actual phone, you can program it to have a screen time limiter. I turned it off. Yeah. The one that tells you how much time you've spent on a screen in a week. I turned it off in the middle of the Brexity stuff because I couldn't look away. I was following the news all the time at some points, and it came back again when it looked like Johnson was going to resign. But
it's all too easy.
24-hour news, though, isn't it? Rather than necessarily social media. And from the child's point of view, what difference will it make?
I think when they look to you, they actually know they're going to get your attention, as opposed to having to fight for it.
Compete for it. I mean,
which is really sad.
It's a really sad phrase. Phenomenon, never mind phrase. A child, and that was the second bit of the conversation. Actually, how old did you say you were? 29.
Yeah, 29.
So your parents wouldn't have been. You weren't competing with phones for your parents' attention.
No, I mean, I do remember my parents getting those brick phones.
Right. No, they don't count, do they? In the context of you feeling that you feeling like they're the competition. So what age group would that be? Would that be people around the age of 20? I guess, who would have actually been competing with their parents' phones for their parents' attention. That's crazy, right? So's this from Stacey. The mobile phone played a massive part in my divorcing my now ex-husband. He lived in it, preferring to be on it than with me. My entire separation and divorce was conducted via WhatsApp. True story. I believe you. I mean, it's not the parenting angle of it, but it's the obsessive nature of it. 11:19 is the time. Steve's in Nottingham. Steve, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. Right. Even just the time I've been listening to you while I've been waiting, there's even more things coming to my head. But the reason I rang
Welcome to my world, Steve.
Well, it's what I think there's going to be a generation of young adults who'll have disruptive issues with parents who social media throughout their childhood. So, for instance, what sparked it with me is, do you remember the Nirvana album cover?
Yes.
With the baby chasing the dollar bill. Do you remember that?
Yes, of course.
Well, that 30-year-old now brought a court case against Nirvana or the publishers or whoever. You know, his image was published without his consent and so on.
I don't know if that's the best example for the point you're making, because I think, it may have been just chancing his arm a bit, that lad, but you're talking more about...
No, it's just what got me thinking, that's all.
Yeah.
But I think there will be a generation of 20-somethings who'll say, hang on a minute, I didn't give my permission for my picture to be, using the potty for the first time, trace it, and as we know, every keystroke and every image and everything is traceable, isn't it? It never really goes away.
I like this theory. I don't know that I agree with it 100% but then we don't know, do we? I mean, you're suggesting something that might happen in the future as a consequence of things happening in the present that didn't happen in the past. So you could well be right.
I think it's imminent, and I think also very similar in the way that a lot of parents put pictures of their kids, school uniform, onto social media. And when I was a teacher a few years ago, this is one thing that we used to try and educate parents with. Don't put kids, don't put our school logo pictures of it, that are traceable and all the rest of it. But I honestly believe...
Well, for safeguarding reasons.
Safeguarding reasons, yeah, because some people don't lock their profiles down.
Well, there's a crucial difference there, because it's if your profile is closed, then you're just showing pictures to family and friends, and we've been doing that since time immemorial.
Yeah, but it's very easy to make a copy of that picture and send it on now, whereas it wasn't before, was it?
No, I know. I mean,
because you just looked at a print, if you like. Yeah. Whereas anybody can save an image.
Well, let's not go down that road, because it's darker than the one we were on already, which is simply that. So talk to me personally. I mean, you're not talking about yourself. You're speculating about what may happen in the future. This sort of invasion of your childhood privacy by the people who love you most in the world coming back to haunt you later in life. It's a weird thought, that. Or perhaps
haunting the parents, maybe more even. But I think it's a big issue that's waiting to go off. I genuinely do. And now, interestingly, my wife and my brother don't do social media whatsoever in any way, shape or form.
Right.
And I don't involve either of my children in social media at all.
How old are they?
One is 8 and one is 16, exactly same as yours. Got her GCSE results today.
How'd she get on?
She did quite well.
Oh, well
she did
done.
Pretty well.
Congratulations.
Yes,
and that's largely luck when they get to that age. You're not going to be able to make the decisions for them, but if you've set the groundwork nicely and correctly, then they might choose not to be on it all the time. Children don't get the credit they deserve for thinking about things quite often, and we often fall into the trap of thinking that the worst examples are emblematic of an entire generation. But all things in moderation is also the watchword. So none at all, you run the risk of being alienated from your year group. Far too much, and you run the risk of being like Stacey's husband, who ends up getting divorced because he can't put his phone down. This is a nice one. Thank you, Steve. This is a nice message. It's not signed. I noticed a lot of phone checking in the mornings before taking my son to nursery, so I came up with a solution. And that's, I don't want to get all dewy-eyed or even patronising, but these are moments, trust me. Ask Steve. When they get to 16, you think, crikey, these are magical moments. And I've spent them checking my phone. So my texter goes on, I've come up with a solution. Now, I don't charge my phone up at night. So I have to plug it in when I get up. So it's undivided attention for the child while the phone is charging. Charge is in the bedroom, playtime is downstairs, and the mornings are now a lot more happy. I think with a toddler, that distraction, that lovely phrase that the first caller used, competing with the phone for your parents' attention, I think with a toddler, that's going to be absolutely key. A couple of phone lines free now. Any thoughts generated by these conversations, welcome. It's not a prescriptive one question only to be answered hour, this one. 03456060973. Lino makes a hilarious point. The irony of Mr. Million Followers at Mr. James O.B. asking parents to call in to discuss parents spending too much time on their phones isn't lost on me. Look, some of us achieve 1 million followers. Some of us are born with 1 million followers, and some of us have 1 million followers thrust upon us. Not quite sure which one I am. Chris is in Glasgow. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi there, I'll get an interesting take.
I'll be the judge of that, pal.
Fair enough. So I'm 28 and have grew up with my parents not using social media because it wasn't a thing.
Okay,
but
yes.
My younger sibling, who's 20, my parents were. So there's a stark contrast between both my upbringing and her upbringing in relation to like social anxiety and other elements around interacting with people, which I think are due to social media. Could have exactly identical upbringing, same household, same family, financial circumstances. No different factor, apart from her being a younger sibling, is the advent of social media.
I mean, we don't know for sure and we can't know for sure, but you're looking at differences in upbringing, different results, and thinking, well, what was different in the upbringing that might explain the different results, and that is going to be one of those things. So mum and dad would be competing with mum and dad's phones for mum and dad's attention.
Yeah, not so much for their attention, but my parents were, for example, quite social. So I would go down to their parents' house, their friends' houses,
right?
Hang with friends, would go out and go outside more. Whilst as social media became, they were less inclined to go and catch up with your auntie down the street, sort of thing.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
She wouldn't be around actual adults or people as much as I was. Therefore, when she's in social situations, as she's grew up, she doesn't really know how to deal with it as naturally as myself or other people around my age.
I hear you. And that, coupled with COVID and lockdowns and things like that for younger people is possibly going to be even more acute. This is one of those hours that I thought was going to be quite sort of softball and straightforward, but it's genuinely fascinating. And before Chris, we spoke to Stephen, who this texter Lucia responds to. I'm just listening to the man talking about sharing pictures of kids on Facebook, etc. My teenage daughter has found her way onto my Facebook and is absolutely outraged at all the comments and pictures that I've shared over the years. She's demanded that I delete. She's very upset. There you go, Stephen. Your theory is coming true live on the radio. It has never crossed my mind. I'm just rapidly thinking now of whether or not we've transgressed in this way. I don't think we have. And of course, on Facebook, I keep things very tight because Twitter is very public facing, but Facebook is very private. Gosh, 27 minutes after 11 is the time. Another Chris, another Scottish Chris. This one in Prestwick. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm good, mate. What's on your mind?
A lot of guilt, I think.
Really?
Yeah. So I kind of recognise in myself that I'll come in after a day at work, I'll be focused on emails, but then I'll also use the phone as a distraction because I've got an 8 and a 5-year-old who can be quite fractious. They're tired. They want my attention. I don't give it to them. And it does kind of fall into chaos at times.
That's very honest of you. So you're absolutely seeing this is a mirror, that we've held up a mirror to you this hour.
Yeah, and there's also another reflection in my daughter's behaviour in that she doesn't ever seem happy unless she's got something new. So I could give her a gift for her birthday, and she's already thinking about what she's getting for her next birthday.
Gosh.
So there's maybe an element of when she's given something that's that attention that she's requiring or seeking. And I think I need to go away and have quite
a little think about
myself.
Yeah, well, attention is more valuable than any present you can give her, and if she feels like she's competing with your phone for your attention, then don't beat yourself up. This is a learning curve for everybody. It started with me acknowledging that I once caught myself checking my phone over my little girl's head while I was supposed to be reading her a bedtime story. So, it's like a support group, this now, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I'm James, and I'm a bad parent.
Thankfully, I do the bedtime story thing.
Well, then you're golden.
I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
So it's not all bad, but there's definitely room for improvement.
Right. Well, for all of us as well, and I guess it never stops, does it? They never stop being a parent. It's coming up to 11:30. Kelly's. I've worked in preschools for nearly 20 years. We can massively see the difference in toddlers' ability to socialise and communicate than even 10 years ago. This is a combination of their own screen use and parents' screen use. Now, if I'd read that to you yesterday, you would have thought it was 100% about children using screens, wouldn't it? But of course it's not. I hadn't thought of it that way around. It's about both. So, I sit here being a bit pompous and po-faced saying, I can't believe you use a iPad as a baby. I did it myself. I used to say, we'll never have iPads in the car. We want to have conversations. We want to play I Spy. They start killing each other and you're only halfway to Cornwall. There's nothing better you can do than stick on Peppa Pig on a screen and hear the calmness spread across the back seat of the car. But the idea of the child's communication skills and socialisation skills being compromised by the parents' use of screen, not by their own use of screen, this is a really big story, actually. And it deserved a little bit more than the treatment I gave it in the opener, which was inspired by a newspaper headline. Get off your phone if you want to be a good parent. How about get off your phone if you want your child to be happier, more rounded, better at socialising and communicating. 11:30 is the time. Simon Conway is here with your headlines. It is 11:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are examining the phenomenon of mums and dads spending too much time on their smartphones. And to be honest, the research looks at the impact it has upon the adults, but the impact it has upon the child as well. That remarkable tweet I read to you just before the news, suggesting that it's the toddler's ability to socialise and communicate, was from Kelly, who works in preschool and has done for nearly 20 years. Compared to even 10 years ago, there's been a measurable decline. And it is, of course, not just because of their own screen use, it's also because of their parents' screen use. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And then Stephen's little story, which I think is going to develop over the years, about children really resenting the amount of photographs in particular that have been put up on social media by parents. That I'd take calls on as well now, because you could be in your late teens, early 20s. I mean, is this true, or are we just having a bit of a storm in a teacup, a bit of a fuss about nothing? Are you cross, upset, even perhaps traumatised by the amount of detail of your private life in childhood that was put on social media by your parents? 0345 6060 973. I've caught myself in a similar situation, James, checking my phone while spending time with my daughter. I've since turned this into using the phone together to watch and play. That's got to be progress, but not necessarily the end of the journey. Let's go back to Glasgow. James is there. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I honestly thought I'd be calling you to bash the Tories at some point.
I'm sure you will. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this conversation, I've got two kids. One of them is 5 years old, and I remember playing with him in his bedroom. And I often listen to like yourself or something like that on the radio while we're playing, or a podcast or something like that. But this one particular day I was looking through my Facebook, and my 5-year-old son calls me out on it, and he says, "Daddy, I feel like you're not involved." And for a 5-year-old to say that to his daddy, it really just struck me like a dagger through the heart.
Oh, mate, of course it did. Of course it did.
So, I'm off work just now through and things. I think social media probably has quite a lot to do with it.
I'm sorry to hear that. Just because you can't turn it off. That's what social media. You can't turn it off in your brain sometimes, and you get het up and angry and stressed and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean that sealed it for me really. So now I've deleted the Facebook, and I don't miss it at all. And it's been about a week and a half, 2 weeks.
Do you think your boys noticed? Do you think your boys noticed a difference?
I think so. He's just started school, so when he comes home from school, it's basically his mum and I are really busy. So they do use the tablets and things like that as well. But we're starting to get into a routine of making them limit screen time and things like that for them personally. But for me, I think that's it for me with social media. I think I'm done.
Fair
I've never
enough.
had a Twitter.
No, yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to see. I saw Robert Lindsay tweeted the other day that he was stepping back from it as well after a conversation with his son. I love Robert Lindsay. He's a brilliant episode of Full Disclosure a few weeks ago. But he quite a prolific tweeter, and obviously decided that it's having a deleterious effect on his home life as well. So I mean, it's horses for courses, isn't it? It is, John Cleese, who's on it this week, says that it's improved his life in all manner of ways, including his relationship with his daughter. So it's going to be horses for courses. But to spot a problem and then do nothing about it is quite delinquent, isn't it? It's a sort of dereliction of parental duty. I wish you well, as long as you're not going to change your radio listening habits, James. That would have terrible ramifications, and your lad will benefit from that almost certainly. There's some fascinating stuff coming in about. I'd never thought of that before, Stephen. You can be the assistant producer for the day. That's a topic, that, isn't it? Kids who don't want their stuff put online. Fee says that Martin Lewis, not for the first time, is ahead of the game on this one. She said, I'm pretty sure I heard Martin Lewis say when his child was born that he wouldn't ever post any photos of his kids on social media, as the photos were his children's property. When they were 18, it was up to them whether they wanted to share it or not. I do understand this, as the humiliation that some folks post, some photos that some folk post, would be mortifying when the child is in their teens and found them, or worse, their friends did. That's incredible. Honestly, it never crossed my mind before, and now I can't stop thinking about it. But I have to, because we have even more important matters to discuss. This week it was the 6-month anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, and obviously it was an invasion undertaken, in his case, in the belief that it would all be over after 3 days, never mind still be raging after 6 months. It occurred to me that we are still not keeping our promise to keep a proper close eye on proceedings in Ukraine and in what is happening there. So if we can't do it this week of all weeks, then we'd really be dereliction of our duty, wouldn't it? So I'm pleased to have two guests today who are going to be able to bring us up to date, essentially, with what has happened, what is happening, and what is likely to happen next. We'll begin with Olga Tokaryuk, who is a Ukrainian journalist based in West Ukraine, and Olga specialises in international relations and disinformation. I feel it wouldn't really be fair to ask you to give us a summary of the state of play right now, Olga. It would be far too big a brief and far too broad a remit. But I would ask you just to perhaps give us a thumbnail sketch of where we are in terms of longevity, how it feels in Ukraine with regard to a possible cessation of hostilities, or does it feel like the two sides are now embedded for an unforeseeable amount of time?
Hi, James. Well, thank you.
Bầu trời chiều không màu nắng ấm, thầm thầm buồn vọng nhớ về đâu. Phương trời xa ai nào hay biết, giang thu nắng